Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. When officers first arrived at the English Villa Madeira cottage at around 2 a.m. of March 25, 1935, they encountered a chaotic and disturbing scene. Bournemouth Police Constable Arthur Bagwell was the first on site, soon followed by Inspector William Mills, and they were greeted by a highly intoxicated and frightened 42-year-old Alma Rattenbury, who was wearing a kimono over her pajamas. Alma, a celebrated Canadian music prodigy, exhibited behavior that was incredibly erratic and frenzied. As the police investigated, she made several contradictory confessions, claiming at various points that she had committed the crime with a mallet, and even that her husband's adult son was responsible. At one point, she put a melancholic love song on the radiogram, attempted to kiss P.C. Bagwell, and offered him a 10-pound bribe before quickly retracting it. Inside the drawing room where the attack occurred, the police discovered that attempts had already been made to clean up the crime scene. They found bloodstains on the carpet and noted that the armchair where Alma's husband, 67-year-old, highly accomplished English architect Francis Rattenbury, had been struck was wet from being washed and smelled of urine. A loose chair cover, completely saturated with blood, had been tossed into the corner of the room. Nearby, a library book titled Stay of Execution lay open face upwards on a small side table. During their search of the rest of the property, the police found a coat and waistcoat that had been thoroughly washed in the downstairs bathroom, as well as a blood-stained collar discarded in a dustbin outside the kitchen door. By 4:30 a.m., the small house was illuminated with lights in every room and overrun by 10 people, including the servants, the family doctor, and several investigating officers. Finally, just after sunrise at 6:15 a.m., P.C. Bagwell discovered the murder weapon, a wooden mallet bearing hair and a piece of bloody flesh, hidden outside behind some boxes near a trellis by the front door. Just 2 hours later, Alma Rattenbury is placed under arrest. She calmly responded, "Yes, that's right, I did it deliberately and would do it again." The Wolff family, the maternal line of Alma, navigated the precarious existence of German immigrants in London's poverty-stricken Walworth district. This convergence of established ambition and immigrant drive was fueled by a distinct necessity for self-mythologizing. For the Wolffs, social mobility required a deliberate cultural rebranding to mask their socio-economic vulnerabilities. In the early 1880s, they reside in the Walworth district of London, characterized by Dickensian squalor. Living at 17 Mason Street, the family's survival depends on the meager income of Ernest Wolff, a German tailor. To escape the stigma of the sweated trades, the family rebrands themselves as German melodists in the South London music hall scene, leveraging a rich musical identity as a tool for social survival. Frances Wolff, Alma's mother, and a supporting player in the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, marries Walter Clark on Christmas Day. The union is soon marked by a visceral tragedy. Their first child, Amy Elizabeth, dies of malnutrition in late 1887 at only 8 weeks old, a stark casualty of the socio-economic pressures and the cold reality of London life. Lured by the narrative of the land of the second chance, the Wolff family, including Frances and Walter, migrates to Victoria, British Columbia, via the SS Mongolian. They flee a London riven by unemployment and the bloody Sunday riots of 1887, seeking a colony that promises prosperity to those possessing both practical skills and cultural ambition. The role of the land of the second chance was not merely a luring narrative, but a catalyst for professional reinvention, where immigrant status acted as a fuel for success rather than a badge of poverty. The Wolfe family's reuse of the D'Oyly Carte Association allowed them to build a social standing in Victoria that would have been impossible in the rigid metropole of London. Alma was born on June 2, 1892, in Victoria, British Columbia, to Frances Wolfe and Walter Clark. She was originally registered as Alma Bell Clark, though her middle name was later changed to Victoria. Her early years were deeply immersed in music, as her mother was a music teacher and elocutionist, and her uncle Ernest was a musician. Following her parents' success running a music school in Victoria, her family relocated to Kamloops, where they established the Kamloops School of Music. Alma's formal education began at Zetland House, a private girls' school in Kamloops. She was a precocious, imaginative only child and a bit of a tomboy, learning the piano and violin under the tutelage of her uncle and her school teachers. She showed an immediate instinct for music and soon began composing her own melodies, imagining that fairies danced to her tunes in the woods near her home. She made what was likely her first public appearance at a gypsy-themed concert in 1898, and at age 8, she delivered her first public solo performance playing Robin Adair on the violin. A formative moment in her childhood occurred in 1901 when the bold young Alma independently sought out and attended a performance by the world-renowned violinist Camilla Urso, who inspired her own ambitions to become a concert soloist. In 1899, Alma's father inherited a fortune of over £10,000, enabling the family to invest heavily in her musical education. This financial security allowed Alma to attend exclusive schools, including Havergal College in Toronto and St. Anne's Academy in Victoria. During this time, she also studied with a professional music teacher, Miss F.M. Smith. On July 9, 1906, 14-year-old Alma auditioned for Frederick Torrington, a highly respected examiner widely regarded as the father of good music in Toronto. Torrington, originally from England, had founded the Toronto College of Music in 1888 and served as its director, making this evaluation a crucial, life-changing opportunity for the young musician. During the audition, Alma performed a demanding repertoire that included Gounod's Serenade, Wagner's Spinning Wheel, and Beethoven's Nocturne No. 5. She executed these pieces so brilliantly that Torrington immediately recognized her exceptional talent. As a direct result of this performance, Alma was awarded the Torrington Medal and offered a scholarship to attend the college. Because Torrington strongly advocated that talented pianists should begin their professional studies early, it was arranged for Alma to commence formal instruction in piano and music theory at the beginning of the fall term in September 1906. This triumphant audition initiated a 3-year period of study directly under Torrington, who would go on to exert a profound and formative influence on her early career and musical education. During the spring term of 1907, while studying at the Toronto College of Music, Alma began suffering from severe stomach cramps, abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. As her health rapidly deteriorated, her mother summoned her father, Walter, to her bedside, and she was admitted to the hospital with a diagnosis of appendicitis. At the time, appendicitis had only been a recognized diagnosis since 1880 and remained a highly dangerous and potentially fatal condition. An emergency operation was performed, but press reports in early May indicated that the procedure had not gone well. The severity of her condition even made the newspapers in her hometown of Victoria, which noted her local celebrity status and reported that her life is now despaired of. Alma's life hung in the balance throughout the entire summer due to the appendicitis and the subsequent surgical complications. She was finally discharged from the hospital at the beginning of August to begin her convalescence. Despite the severity of this prolonged ordeal, Alma remained determined not to let the illness derail her ambitions and promptly resumed her musical studies. At 17, Alma performed the Mendelssohn Concerto with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra during her time at the Toronto College of Music, giving public recitals with a full orchestra at Massey Hall, a massive 3,500-seat venue. Reflecting on the event, Alma described this specific performance as the most difficult thing she had done up to that point in her young career. Despite the profound challenge of the piece, she was deeply moved by the experience, recalling that playing alongside the orchestra carried me away and stating simply, "I loved it." The concert was a significant success. She received splendid support from the audience and was immensely proud of the highly favorable, good notices she earned from the local press. Despite her youth, Alma was technically highly accomplished, fearless, and free from debilitating stage fright. She performed the European classical repertoire entirely from memory and would famously throw herself into the emotion of the music, admitting that she would usually lose myself and forget everything once a concert began. Following these triumphs, she graduated with her diploma as an associate of the Toronto College of Music in 1909, prompting the college's director, Frederick Torrington, to proudly boast to the press that she was a musical wonder. To celebrate her graduation and remarkable success, her father rewarded her with a brand new grand piano upon their relocation to Vancouver. By the following year, she was being celebrated in a feature by Westward Ho magazine as Canada's musical prodigy, poised at the threshold of a brilliant international career as a concert pianist. By the early 1910s, the family dynamic was defined by financial security and a hyper-focus on her extraordinary musical potential. Alma enjoyed a uniquely warm and indulgent relationship with her parents, affectionately calling her mother Chum and her father my only dad. Her mother, who had experienced a lackluster career as a supporting stage performer, channeled all her own unfulfilled creative ambition into her adored only child. Believing Alma was destined for global fame, her parents even prepared to send her to Germany so she could acquire the European pedigree demanded of international concert soloists at the time. This intense familial investment was rooted in a deeply performatic family culture that profoundly shaped how Alma navigated her entire life. Her maternal family, the Wolfs, were essentially the Von Trapps of Victoria, regularly headlining local concerts. Raised in this theatrical environment, Alma developed the instincts of a born performer who threw herself entirely into the emotion of her music. Caledon Robert John Radcliffe Dowling was a tall, bespectacled Irishman of aristocratic descent who worked as a real estate agent in Vancouver. Because Alma's father also dealt in property at the time, it is highly likely that he introduced the two. During their courtship, Alma completely mesmerized Dowling with her highly performative and dramatic nature. She would be, quote, wildly gay and would fling her arms in the air, only to suddenly become silent and subdued, using her magnetic gray eyes to captivate his attention. Her mother enthusiastically approved of the match, as marrying into an ancient French Huguenot and aristocratic family justified the family's migration to Canada and represented the ultimate upward social mobility. Although Alma later liked to romanticize their union as a sudden elopement, they were formally married on July 23, 1913, at St. Mark's Church in Seattle. Alma, who was 22 at the time, wore a traveling suit and carried a bouquet of lilies of the valley, while her mother gave her away. They spent their honeymoon touring British Columbia. Dowling's brother recalled seeing the newlyweds upon their return to Vancouver, noting that Alma looked absolutely radiant and superb. At this stage, they were deeply in love, and Alma seemed poised for a bright future as both a wife and a concert pianist. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. The trajectory of their marriage shifted dramatically with the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. Dowling enlisted and was sent to the port of Prince Rupert as a second-in-command for a training division. Alma accompanied her husband to this posting, where she devoted all her spare time to organizing boxing, athletic, and singing competitions for his men. However, Dowling was desperate to see frontline combat. In August 1915, the couple sailed to England so he could secure a combat role, and he was eventually commissioned into the Royal Welch Fusiliers. The couple officially separated when Darling was deployed to the trenches of northern France in October 1915, while Alma remained behind in England. During this period of separation, Alma lived with Darling's aunt in Chislehurst and worked at the War Office in Whitehall. They were forced to communicate through heavily censored, brief telegrams, leaving Alma with no idea at all where he was, or the horrific conditions he was enduring at the front. During his deployment, Darling proved to be a highly respected and brave soldier, winning the Military Cross for his actions. Their physical separation became permanent when Darling was killed instantly by a shell on August 21, 1916, during a raid on High Wood at the Somme. The loss of her husband shattered 24-year-old Alma, leaving her a grieving war widow. In the summer of 1917, Alma was among the first women to travel to France, near Soissons, to establish a new frontline hospital for the Scottish Women's Hospitals. The site was a deserted evacuation center consisting of 2 rows of wooden huts situated right next to the local railway station. The facility was initially an awful mess, and the women worked like the dickens to repair the basic structures, which featured corrugated iron roofs, oil-papered windows, and duckboard paths laid across the ever-present mud. Once operational, the hospital boasted 211 beds, a staff of 33, and a covered walkway linking the wards directly to the railway station so that wounded soldiers could be lifted straight into the hospital without being exposed to the elements. Living conditions for the staff at the front line were harsh. Alma recalled sleeping on the floor on a palliasse and enduring the terrifying sounds of bombs dropping nearby at night. Despite the constant threat of German attacks, Alma humorously noted that she was much more afraid of the rats than the Germans, as she would jump up and throw her shoes to chase them away in the dark. Despite the difficult conditions, the atmosphere was distinctly informal and harmonious, with doctors and orderlies living together and calling each other by their surnames. Though she was officially an orderly, Alma wrote home that she was effectively doing the demanding work of a nurse. She wrote, "Really, we are nurses and not orderlies," and expressed deep concern about how they would survive the impending winter, as the separate huts forced the staff to go outside into the cold for absolutely everything. Alma's time at the front line was incredibly dangerous. Press reports in the early 1920s later claimed that she had performed heroic work at Soissons and was wounded by a shell while dressing the injuries of an Arab soldier. These same reports stated that she was awarded the Croix de Guerre by Marshal Joffre for her bravery, though no official record of the decoration survives. Alma's time at Villers-Cotterêts was relatively brief. She left the field hospital in October 1917 and briefly returned to the main hospital at Royaumont Abbey. Her service with the Scottish Women's Hospitals formally concluded on January 6, 1918, after which she returned to England. Still grieving the loss of her first husband in the First World War, Alma met Thomas Compton Pakenham, known affectionately to friends as Compy, within days of returning to England from France in January 1918. Pakenham, who was on leave at the time, was a decorated officer who had been awarded the Military Cross for his bravery in combat. He was also a married man with a young daughter named Simona. Despite knowing about his wife and child, Alma pursued the relationship, and their courtship escalated quickly under the looser conventions of wartime. By the summer of 1918, the couple was living openly together in a hotel in Grantham, near Pakenham's station at Harrowby Barracks. Pakenham's wife, Phyllis, tracked him down and wrote a desperate letter to him in September 1918, begging him to return to her and their baby because she had been left without money and was facing starvation. Deep into his affair with Alma, Pakenham replied on October 1st with a short, uncompromising refusal, calling the prospect of returning to his marriage an absurd mockery. As a result, on January 23, 1919, a notice was served to Pakenham at his barracks holding him guilty of deserting his wife and explicitly naming Alma as his mistress. A decree nisi was issued in June 1919, and the divorce was finalized with a decree absolute in January 1920. Eager to leave England and the war's destructive memories behind them, Alma and Pakenham sailed to America on the Caronia, arriving in New York on September 24, 1919. Because Pakenham's divorce was not yet final, the couple lied to the immigration authorities at Ellis Island to disguise the fact that they were unmarried. They claimed they were Irish peers and that Pakenham was the son of Sir William Compton Pakenham, a senior British naval commander who was, in reality, Pakenham's unmarried uncle. Once Pakenham was legally free to marry, the couple officially wed in Brooklyn in July 1920. The couple rented an apartment on 11th Avenue and later moved to Long Island. To make a living, Pakenham worked as a magazine writer and traveled to give lectures on Japanese economics under the completely fabricated title of Dr. Pakenham. Meanwhile, Alma's former ambitions of becoming an international concert soloist were reduced to giving private piano lessons. On July 8, 1921, Alma gave birth to their son, Christopher, who was affectionately called Toffee. Unfortunately, the arrival of their child coincided with acute financial difficulties, and the marriage rapidly broke down. Sources note that Alma was no better at holding down a relationship with Compy than Phyllis had been. Sadder and wiser, Alma wrote to her mother in Canada for help. In March 1922, her mother traveled to New York, collected Alma and baby Christopher, and brought them back to Vancouver. This effectively ended Alma's relationship with Pakenham, and she resolved to focus her life entirely on raising her son and teaching music. Though she was briefly billed as Mrs. Compton Pakenham during a piano recital in Victoria in 1923, her second marriage was over. Francis Mawson Rattenbury was born on October 11, 1867, in Leeds to a Methodist family. His mother, Mary Ann Mawson, was a profound and guiding influence on his life and ambition, whereas he felt little warmth for his father, John, whom he judged to be a mediocre professional artist. He was educated at Leeds Grammar School and briefly enrolled at Yorkshire College with the intention of joining his mother's family textile business. However, after his mother noticed his creative talent in some Christmas cards he drew in 1884, she introduced him to her brothers, William and Richard, who were partners in the prominent Yorkshire architectural practice Lockwood and Mawson. Francis joined his uncle's firm in 1885. Lockwood and Mawson was highly respected, having built its reputation on designing a model manufacturing community in Saltaire for the industrialist Titus Salt, as well as significant civic buildings like the Bradford Town Hall. However, Rattenbury's time working at the firm was ultimately disappointing because the practice's key creative figure, Henry Lockwood, had already passed away. Without Lockwood's ambition and creativity driving the business, the ambitious young Rattenbury quickly realized that the firm's most successful days were behind it and felt there was little more he could learn from his surviving uncle. Hearing reports of a massive building boom on the west coast of Canada, Rattenbury decided to leave the firm and emigrated to British Columbia, arriving in Vancouver in 1892. Upon his arrival, he audaciously used his connection to his uncle's firm for self-promotion, placing an advertisement in the Vancouver Daily World, claiming he had spent 10 years erecting buildings with Lockwood and Mawson and had trained directly under the late Henry Lockwood. In reality, this was a complete fabrication, as Rattenbury was only 11 years old when Lockwood died. Against all odds, he won the prestigious $600,000 commission at just 25 years old. Despite budget overruns and clashes with contractors, the Marble Palace opened to immense acclaim in 1898, instantly elevating Rattenbury from an unknown immigrant to the most celebrated architect in the province. After the Canadian Pacific Railway made Vancouver its terminus, Victoria's population and economy began to noticeably decline. To counter this, the local Chamber of Commerce decided to rebrand Victoria as the leading health and pleasure resort in the Northwest to attract wealthy tourists. However, this required cleaning up the James Bay mudflats, a foul-smelling tidal rubbish dump located directly next to Francis Rattenbury's recently completed Parliament buildings. In 1900, local businessmen partnered with the Tourist Association and Sir Alfred Shaughnessy, the president of the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR. The city offered the CPR half of the reclaimed 9-acre mudflat site, along with 15 years of tax exemptions and free water, to develop a destination hotel. As the province's most celebrated architect, Rattenbury was commissioned to draw up the plans. Because the site overlooked James Bay, he specifically designed a grand 7-story, 350-bedroom building intended to complement his adjacent Marble Palace Parliament buildings. He skillfully blended the CPR's signature Franco-Scottish architectural style with Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Gothic features to create a uniquely iconic structure for the city. Shaughnessy officially named the building the Empress in September 1905 to honor the late Queen Victoria, as well as the CPR's own Empress shipping line. Although it finally opened late and vastly over budget on January 2, 1908, the Empress Hotel was an immediate triumph. It abandoned dark Victorian fussiness in favor of light, expansive grounds and magnificent open views of the harbor, proving once again Rattenbury's visionary ability to define the aesthetic of the imperial age. During the construction of the Parliament buildings, Rattenbury's personal life took a complicated turn. He became involved with Florrie Nunn, a quiet young woman who lacked his wealth and social status. When Florrie became pregnant, societal conventions obliged Rattenbury to marry her on June 18, 1898, in a union that was devoid of romantic feeling. They had 2 children, a son, Francis Burgoyne, Snooky, born with a foot deformity in 1899, and a daughter, Mary, born in 1904. Rattenbury built his family a beautiful arts and crafts style home in Oak Bay named Iikineal, an indigenous word meaning the place where a good thing happened. However, the marriage was utterly joyless. The couple's differences in character, Rattenbury's outgoing ambition versus Florrie's prim, judgmental nature, grew into deep antipathy. Eventually, Rattenbury retreated to a solitary life of drinking in his room, entirely estranged from his wife and children. Professionally, Rattenbury also suffered devastating setbacks. An early attempt to operate a fleet of riverboats during the Klondike Gold Rush had been a complete failure. Later, seeking to fund his retirement, he gambled his vast fortune on 40,000 acres of land along the proposed Grand Trunk Pacific Railroad route. When the First World War broke out, the railway project collapsed into bankruptcy, rendering his land worthless. His ruin was compounded in 1921 when the government compulsorily purchased these lands, leading to a catastrophic personal loss of over $500,000. A chance for redemption finally arrived in the early 1920s when local officials enlisted the veteran architect to design the Crystal Garden, a massive glass-roofed amusement center behind the Empress Hotel. On December 29, 1923, local taxpayers voted to approve the scheme, and that evening, a jubilant banquet was thrown in Rattenbury's honor at the Empress. Hearing the raucous sound of men singing, "For he's a jolly good fellow," a curious 31-year-old Alma Pakenham, then still married to her second husband, investigated the banqueting hall with a friend. Her friend happened to know Rattenbury and introduced them. Intoxicated by the festive atmosphere, Alma boldly told the 55-year-old architect, "You have the kindest face I ever saw." The deeply unhappy, aging Rattenbury was absolutely mesmerized by the vibrant young musician, sparking an immediate infatuation that would permanently alter the course of both their lives. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Early in 1924, Alma moved from her mother's home in Vancouver to Victoria, initially living with her Aunt Emma Criddle at 514 Dallas Road, before relocating to a house on Niagara Street in Beacon Hill Park. When Alma first moved into her own house on Niagara Street, local society was entirely unaware that she was using the private residence for clandestine meetings with the married Francis Rattenbury. Because she was the young widow of a decorated soldier killed in the First World War, the community initially welcomed her with open arms. Margaret McClure, the wife of Rattenbury's architect friend Sam McClure, and a prominent leader in Victoria's artistic and musical circles, took a special interest in Alma, and took her under her wing. Though Mrs. McClure was known as a strict disciplinarian, she was surprisingly indulgent toward Alma, even remaining tight-lipped on one occasion when Alma's young son Christopher caused chaos by throwing sofa cushions around her parlor. However, the conservative local matrons fiercely monitored their society's moral behavior, and Rattenbury's frequent visits to Alma's house did not go unnoticed for long. The affair was definitively exposed due to a specific incident involving Mrs. McClure's charity. Hearing that Alma was unwell, Margaret McClure generously brought a hamper of soup to the Niagara Street house. Shortly afterward, a neighbor who lived across the street reported back to Mrs. McClure that she had seen Alma leaving the house with Rattenbury, and the two had been spotted enjoying the hamper of soup together in nearby Beacon Hill Park. Mrs. McClure immediately telephoned Alma to confront her, stating, "People have been saying things about you, and now I can see that they were right." Rather than showing remorse or embarrassment, Alma was entirely dismissive of the criticism. She was highly confident that she would soon become Rattenbury's next wife, and arrogantly believed that the very people currently censuring her would one day beg to be invited as guests to her home. Once the relationship became public knowledge, Rattenbury completely defied social convention by acquiring an opera box and openly taking Alma with him to performances. This brazen behavior stunned Sam McClure, who had known Rattenbury for nearly 30 years and now felt his old friend was completely bewitched. With his infatuation fueling local gossip, Rattenbury asked his wife, Florrie, for a divorce, but she adamantly refused. In response, Rattenbury moved out of his family home and began a cruel campaign of harassment against Florrie. He sent moving vans to remove the best furniture, which Florrie and a servant managed to lock away in a maid's room to protect it, and then laid siege to the house by ordering the electricity and heating to be turned off. Despite Margaret McClure bringing Florrie food hampers to help her survive, the battle escalated until July 28, 1924, when Florrie won a legal injunction that secured her right to stay in the home. Refusing to be defeated by the legal directive, Rattenbury began inviting Alma directly into the drawing room at Aquineal, forcing the deeply distressed Florrie to retreat to her upstairs bedroom. During one of these visits, Rattenbury's daughter, Mary, came downstairs to ask Alma to stop playing the piano because Florrie was upset and unable to sleep. According to Mary, Alma responded to the request by playing a funeral march as loudly as she could. Utterly exhausted by the relentless battle against her husband and his mistress, Florrie could fight no longer. Shortly after these events, she finally capitulated and agreed to a divorce on January 28, 1925. Ultimately, Alma's assumption that marrying Rattenbury would force the society matrons to accept her proved to be a massive miscalculation. The affair permanently ruined their social standing in Victoria. In the spring of 1927, long after she had officially become the second Mrs. Rattenbury, Alma attempted to build bridges and called Margaret McClure to negotiate her readmission into polite society. Introducing herself on the telephone as Mrs. Rattenbury, Alma was met with feigned confusion from Margaret, who pointedly asked, "Which Mrs. Rattenbury?" When Alma tried to clarify, Margaret delivered a cutting rebuke, insisting she knew of only one Mrs. Rattenbury, Francis's first wife, Florence. Having betrayed the strict conventions of Victoria society, Alma and Rattenbury remained unforgiven social pariahs. Alma gave birth to a son, John, on December 27, 1928, following a period of severe ill health for her and a great deal of joy for Francis. The child was named after Francis's father and late brother, and possibly in honor of a 17th century ancestor who had served as the mayor of Okehampton. Less than a year later, Florence Florrie Rattenbury died of a brain hemorrhage on October 13, 1929, at the age of 59. The next day, Alma naively visited Florrie's daughter, Mary, to offer her condolences, drastically underestimating the deep, abiding hatred Mary harbored toward her. Mary claimed Alma arrived high on drugs and spoke loathingly of Francis, prompting Mary to abruptly dismiss Alma from the house. This disastrous confrontation effectively marked the permanent end of Francis Rattenbury's relationship with his two older children. Following Florey's death, Francis was completely cold-shouldered by his former friends at the Union Club and found himself unable to stand the animus of the Victoria people any longer. He and Alma decided to leave British Columbia in exile for a fresh start in England. Before departing, Francis changed his will on December 18, 1929, explicitly disinheriting his older children, Frank and Mary, and leaving his entire estate to Alma's children. Their departure from the docks was a bleak, joyless event, rather than the start of a great adventure. Frank recalled his father looking pretty blue and realizing he had made a frightful mistake, while Alma was reportedly in a stupor from alcohol or drugs. The only person to see them off with genuine sadness was the family gardener, Foy, who cried as they departed. The family embarked on a meandering 6-month journey accompanied by a nursemaid. They sailed through the Panama Canal to Havana and then on to New York, where Francis accrued a massive gambling debt during a card game with professionals. Unable to pay what he owed, he woke the family in the middle of the night to flee by train to Montreal, from where they sailed to Europe. After visiting Venice and living briefly in northern France, where Francis purchased a right-hand drive Fiat saloon and Christopher went to school, they finally crossed the Channel from St. Malo on June 28, 1930. Upon arriving in England, they initially planned to settle in Okehampton, Devon, Francis's ancestral home, where they had young John baptized in August 1930. However, Francis was bitterly disappointed by the reality of the town, dismissing it as ugly, dirty, and stupid. Even before the Rattenbury family fled British Columbia for a new life in England, Alma's health had taken a devastating turn. In 1928, she suffered a terrifying brain abscess, a harrowing ordeal during which at least a pint of evil-smelling clotted blood and mucus drained from her nose and ears, causing her to lose 12 pounds. Just as she began to recover from this nightmare, a severe slip left her with a badly sprained ankle, confining her to bed for an entire month. Because of this extreme physical frailty, the family specifically chose the seaside resort of Bournemouth, drawn by the town's temperate climate and its reputation for convalescent homes. In September 1931, the Rattenburys settled into the Villa Madeira, a small, white, pebble-dashed house on Manor Road in the quiet East Cliff area of Bournemouth. Rented fully furnished for 6 guineas a week from a local tobacconist, the dark suburban property was a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury of their former Canadian estate. Alma, possessing a horror of the color white, quickly filled the rooms with busy, feminine floral chintz. The house's layout allowed the couple to live increasingly separate lives. Francis, rapidly aging and depressed, took a ground-floor bedroom next to the drawing room, while Alma slept upstairs in the back bedroom with their young son, John, effectively ending any physical marital relationship. To young John, these early years were marked by keen, idyllic memories. Alma would wake her boys at dawn for swims in the sea as the sun rose, letting John ride on her back. There were picnics in the New Forest where she played the violin while the boys swam, and warm afternoons when John slept outside in a canvas sun shelter that was erected in the garden. She taught him to read and dance, and spent evenings playing card games or reading stories like Peter Pan and Winnie the Pooh. Francis, however, was a reclusive figure in the household, often retreating to his architectural drawings, drafting clean, straight lines of buildings on crisp white paper at his easel. The reality of managing the household fell to Alma, who was given a monthly allowance of £50 to cover the staff, medical bills, and living expenses. Chaotic with money and struggling to count on her fingers, she was perpetually overdrawn, relying on her husband to guarantee her debts. In 1931, she placed an advertisement for a companion help, hiring a 22-year-old Bournemouth native named Irene Riggs. Irene soon became accustomed to Alma's eccentricities, chain smoking, wearing silk pajamas around the house all day, and suffering from wild mood swings that saw her running excitedly about the garden before falling into deep, sudden sleeps. Rather than maintaining the formal boundaries of mistress and servant, Alma treated Irene as a close friend and confidant, showering her with gifts and taking her on trips. These erratic mood swings were undoubtedly exacerbated by Alma's fragile health. She suffered from painfully swollen lymph nodes in her neck that regularly required lancing by the local surgeon. Her medicine cabinet was heavily stocked with sedatives, painkillers, and treatments like Stanoxyl and chlorodyne. To combat the crushing monotony of her provincial life, she often self-medicated with heavy doses of cocktails and wine, while Francis drank his whiskey alone in his armchair at night. Socially isolated, their only regular visitors were their doctor, William O'Donnell, their landlady, and Francis's surveyor friend, D.A. Wood. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Alma's maternal worries deepened when her older son, Christopher, developed a leg condition that required ongoing medical attention. She consulted a Dr. Basker in Southbourne, who prescribed a rigorous and distressing treatment plan, a series of injections that Alma herself had to administer to the boy at his school, using a hypodermic syringe she kept safely tucked away in the medical cupboard of her bedroom. The physical and emotional toll of these painful treatments soon began to manifest darkly in the 11-year-old's behavior. Alma grew increasingly alarmed when Christopher started creating deeply disturbing sketches and leaving them scattered all over the house. One particularly chilling drawing depicted a boy sitting up in bed, clutching a sixpence, while a man leaned menacingly over him with a stick, drawn as though the man had driven a long hypodermic needle right through the child's arm. To the household companion, Irene Riggs, who observed the increasingly macabre artwork, all of the boy's drawings were undeniably weird. Desperate to understand her son's troubled state of mind, Alma turned to alternative methods and sought the help of W.G. Clark, a practitioner of phrenology based in nearby Boscombe. Hoping this popular pseudoscience, which claimed to assess a person's character and temperament through the observation and measurement of their skull, might provide some much-needed answers, she had Clark examine Christopher. She was ultimately so impressed and reassured by Clark's reading of her son's personality that she generously tipped him an extra £5 in appreciation of his accuracy, and she immediately commissioned him to perform a phrenological assessment on herself. In October 1932, Alma placed an advertisement in the local newspaper for a chef and hired 34-year-old Frank Hobbs as a cook general. He was given the spare bedroom right next to Alma's own room. Almost immediately, Alma began crossing boundaries, spending a great deal of time in the kitchen confiding in Hobbs. She shared intimate details about her past marriages, including the fact that her mother had arranged her union with her husband, and even sought Hobbs's opinion on the lyrics of the songs she was composing. The relationship took a dramatic turn after just 2 or 3 weeks, when Hobbs returned to the house on his Wednesday afternoon off. He found Alma waiting for him in the kitchen, where she instructed him to stop calling her Madam and declared that they were equals. She bluntly admitted that she had hired him over applicants with superior references purely because he possessed sex appeal. Despite his visible shock, Alma was uncompromising, telling him, "I know what I am saying quite well. I want you, and I mean to have you." Horrified by her advances, Hobbs reminded Alma that her husband and children were in the house, insisting he was not that sort of man before retreating to his bedroom. When Alma followed him, he tactfully pushed her out and locked his door. Alma spent the night persistently tapping on his bedroom door, eventually giving up and retreating to her bed in a humiliated depression for several days. When she finally emerged, she approached Hobbs while he was preparing breakfast and apologized, praising him as a perfect brick for refusing to do what she had wanted. Hobbs assured her the matter was entirely closed and carried on with his duties. However, just 2 weeks later, Francis Rattenbury, who was completely oblivious to his wife's attempted seduction, suddenly dismissed the chef. Rattenbury claimed the family could no longer afford him due to the economic depression and gave Hobbs 2 weeks' wages in lieu of notice. Hobbs strongly suspected that Alma, still hurt and embarrassed by his rejection, had secretly persuaded her husband to fire him. Hobbs packed his belongings and departed that same afternoon, keeping the sordid incident a secret from both Alma and the companion help, Irene. As she turned 40 in the summer of 1932, feeling frustrated and creatively starved in her quiet suburban life, Alma Rattenbury had her grand piano shipped over from Canada and began composing romantic ballads once again. Her husband recognized the potential of her tunes, and after facing initial rejections from publishers like Boosey and Hawkes, managed to secure an introduction to Simon Van Leer, the general manager of the music publishing division at Keith Prowse. During a meeting in his London office in late 1931 or early 1932, Alma played one of her compositions for Van Leer, who was instantly captivated, declaring her a genius whose mind was teeming with exquisite tunes and promising to publish, orchestrate, and broadcast her work. To launch this new chapter of her life, Alma adopted the exotic-sounding pseudonym Lausanne, and Van Leer quickly paired her with the veteran lyricist Edward Lockton. Alma also set her sights on the popular tenor Frank Titterton to vocalize her melodies, eventually forming a warm professional relationship with him that resulted in the recording of 12 songs between 1932 and 1935, 2 of which featured Alma herself accompanying him on the piano. Initially, this new career seemed incredibly promising, bringing Alma both creative fulfillment and financial reward, with her royalty payments reaching a respectable £47 by September 1933. The public was introduced to her music through BBC radio broadcasts by Titterton, who publicly praised her beautiful melodies. However, the fame and fortune that Van Leer had so enthusiastically predicted ultimately failed to materialize. Alma's yearning, sentimental ballads were rooted in a pre-war aesthetic and proved to be entirely out of step with the fast-paced, jazz-influenced music that was increasingly dominating the wireless programs and dance halls of the 1930s. As the public lost interest in her old-fashioned musical style, her royalty payments dwindled drastically to a mere £1 by September 1934. As 1934 unfolded, the promise of Alma and Francis Rattenbury's earlier years together dissolved into a suffocating and fractured domestic reality at the Villa Madeira. The stark age gap between the couple became increasingly unbridgeable, with the 67-year-old Rattenbury rapidly aging, struggling with his dentures, and retreating into a reclusive depression. His gloom was exacerbated by mounting financial anxieties and professional disappointments, culminating in his failure to secure backing for a new apartment block scheme and his resignation from his beloved Union Club. He spent his evenings drinking whiskey alone in his armchair, effectively ending any intimate relationship with his much younger wife by occupying a separate bedroom on the ground floor. Alma, creatively stifled as her songwriting royalties dwindled to almost nothing, was physically plagued by the painful complications of tuberculosis and self-medicated with heavy doses of cocktails and wine, despite her doctor's warnings. This suffocating atmosphere reached a breaking point on July 9th, when a deeply depressed Rattenbury threatened to commit suicide by putting his head in the gas oven. When an exasperated Alma told him to go ahead, he struck her in the face, prompting her to bite his arm in retaliation before he stormed out of the house. He left Alma with a black eye and a cut eyebrow that required a sedative injection of morphia from Dr. O'Donnell. Acknowledging the vast chasm between them, Rattenbury even suggested that Alma should start living her own life and seek out a lover. Despite the toxic environment between the parents, Alma remained fiercely devoted to her children, maintaining a warm and idyllic relationship with them. She showered her younger son, John, with affection, calling him her chipmunk. Rattenbury, though an increasingly distant figure in the household, still inspired awe in young John, occasionally sharing his clean, straight architectural drawings or gifting the boy a wooden model house. In late September 1934, Alma Rattenbury placed an advertisement in the Bournemouth Echo seeking a daily lad for housework and driving duties. George Percy Stoner, a fit, fair-haired local youth with a frank, open face, answered the advertisement, falsely claiming to be 22 when he was actually only 17. Conducting the interview in her pajamas, Alma was instantly captivated by the young man. Stoner began his employment at the end of the month, initially serving as a chauffeur handyman who took his meals with the companion help Irene Riggs and returned home to his grandparents' house in Ansbury Park each night. The dynamic between Alma and Stoner shifted dramatically around November 19th, when she discovered his true age on his 18th birthday. A few days later, Alma arranged a road trip to Leeds, accompanied by Irene and driven by Stoner, but the trio only made it as far as Oxford because Stoner complained his watch was broken. They stayed the night at the Randolph Hotel, and it was during this excursion away from her husband that Alma boldly articulated her feelings to Stoner, leading them to have sex for the first time on November 22nd. To remedy his lack of a timepiece, Alma loaned him her late father's prized gold hunter watch, an item of immense sentimental value. Upon their return to Bournemouth, the affair brazenly escalated as Stoner moved into the Villa Madeira's empty master bedroom. He soon established a routine of undressing in his own room before crossing the landing to spend the night in Alma's bed, gradually taking on more intimate responsibilities like cashing her checks and paying her bills. As the new year began, Alma grew increasingly anxious about the stark age difference between them and repeatedly attempted to break things off. Stoner, an inexperienced youth completely consumed by his first adult relationship, reacted with an absurdly jealous possessiveness toward Alma's husband, Francis, and would fly into rages whenever Alma broached the subject of a breakup. To intimidate her, Stoner even began carrying a 4-inch knife and threatened her with a revolver, which was later revealed to be a toy. The tension finally snapped one night in February between 11 p.m. and midnight. A fierce argument broke out in Alma's bedroom, with Alma once again insisting that her responsibilities as a married mother of 2 and their age difference meant the relationship had to end. Furious, Stoner stormed out of her room and retreated to his own quarters in the master bedroom. Alma followed him, and the altercation turned violently physical. Irene Riggs heard the commotion and interrupted the fight, walking into the master bedroom to find Stoner with his hands tightly gripping Alma's throat. Irene swiftly intervened, physically separating the two, and sent a deeply shaken Alma back to bed. Throughout the entire violent struggle, Francis remained downstairs, completely oblivious to the danger his wife was in. In the aftermath of this assault, Stoner attempted to excuse his alarming, aggressive outbursts by falsely claiming to Alma and her doctor, William O'Donnell, that he had a queer brain and was addicted to cocaine. Despite the strangulation attempt and his bizarre claims, Alma remained utterly devoted to him, indulging his tantrums and keeping the violent reality of their affair hidden from her husband. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In the early hours of March 25th, 1935, the police were prompted to visit the Villa Madeira after a severely injured Francis Rattenbury was taken to the Strathallan nursing home in an ambulance with Dr. William O'Donnell. In the operating theater, Surgeon Alfred Rook cleaned Francis's head and realized the deep fractures had been caused by great force from a heavy blunt instrument. Making it clear this was a deliberate act of violence rather than an accidental fall against a piano, Rook instructed Dr. O'Donnell to call the police. Police Constable Arthur Bagwell arrived at the nursing home at 1:30 a.m., confirmed the injuries were no accident, and subsequently cycled to the Villa Madeira, arriving at about 2 a.m. Upon arriving at the house, P.C. Bagwell knocked on the front door, which was opened by Alma Rattenbury and the companion help, Irene Riggs. Alma, who was wearing a kimono over her pajamas, led the constable into the drawing room at the back of the house. Bagwell's immediate assessment of the lady of the house was that she was both very frightened and very drunk. When he asked how her husband had come by his horrific injuries, Alma claimed they had been playing cards until 9 p.m., after which she went to bed. She stated that at 10:30 p.m. she heard a yell, ran downstairs, and found her husband unconscious and bleeding in his chair. Just as Alma was giving this statement to Bagwell, Inspector William Mills arrived at the scene. He, too, immediately noticed that Alma was heavily intoxicated. He asked her to explain what had happened, and she repeated her story. However, Mills astutely noticed that the left-hand door of the drawing room's French windows was open. When he asked Alma if the window had been open when she originally came downstairs, she firmly insisted that it had been shut and locked. This seemingly minor detail about the locked window drastically shaped Inspector Mills's initial assessment of the situation. He immediately deduced that if the house had been secured from the inside, whoever had attacked Frances Rattenbury must already live in the house. Since the only people present that night were Alma, her 6-year-old son, and the 2 servants, the authorities felt the case against Alma was already writing itself. The 2 officers then conducted an initial search of the house, which revealed a grim and chaotic scene. Alongside the bloodstains on the drawing room carpet, they found that the seat of Frances's armchair was wet and smelled of urine, and bloodstains had been hastily washed from its back and arm. A blood-saturated loose cover had been removed from the chair and dumped in the corner of the room. The search also uncovered a coat and waistcoat that had been thoroughly washed in the downstairs bathroom, as well as a blood-stained collar discarded in a dustbin outside the kitchen door. During his initial search of the chaotic drawing room, Inspector William Mills made a curious discovery on a small side table near the fireplace. He found a library book lying face upwards, open at page 296. The book was Stay of Execution by Elliot Crochet Williams. Recognizing its potential significance, Mills turned down the corner of the open page and took possession of it as evidence. Earlier that night, a frantic Alma had tried to force Dr. O'Donnell to read a passage from this very book, claiming her husband had shown it to her as an allusion to suicide. The passage in question described the tragedy of elderly men marrying young women, noting the grim inevitabilities of aging, such as false teeth falling out, a detail that eerily mirrored the gruesome scene on the drawing room floor. While Inspector Mills briefly left the house to visit the nursing home, Alma was left alone in the drawing room with Police Constable Arthur Bagwell when her behavior became wildly erratic. She suddenly announced to the constable that she knew who had committed the crime, before abruptly confessing, "I did it with a mallet." She claimed her husband had lived too long, and that she had hidden the weapon. Moments later, she contradicted herself before attempting to bribe Bagwell with £10, an offer she quickly retracted. Amidst these baffling statements, Alma turned to the radio gramophone and put on a record of a melancholic love song called Dark-Haired Marie, sung by her friend, the tenor Frank Titterton. As the music played, her behavior escalated from erratic to inappropriate as she began to pester PC Bagwell, even attempting to kiss him. The deeply uncomfortable constable, who also needed to use the lavatory but feared she would follow him, used the excuse of finding another officer to finally escape her presence. When Inspector Mills returned, Alma continued her frantic confessions, staggering between the officers and cryptically stating, "I did it. He gave me the book. I will tell you in the morning where the mallet is." Detective Inspector William Carter arrived at the chaotic and brightly lit Villa Madeira at 4:30 a.m. to find the house teeming with police, servants, and the doctor. After assessing the situation, he decided to wait quietly in the bedroom while Alma slept, wanting to ensure she was fully awake and aware before he made his move. When she finally woke at 6 a.m., Carter sent for a police matron to supervise her while she bathed and dressed, ensuring she would not destroy any evidence or attempt to harm herself while left alone in the bathroom. Despite Alma's promise to reveal the weapon's location in the morning, the police continued their search of the property throughout the night. At 6:15 a.m., just as the sun began to rise, PC Bagwell was searching a narrow gap to the left of the front door, situated between the wall of the Villa Madeira and the neighboring property, which featured a decorative trellis. Bending down under an overhanging tree and looking behind some boxes, Bagwell found a wooden mallet. The heavy weapon provided visceral, undeniable evidence of the brutal attack. It was covered in hair and a piece of bloody flesh. By 8:15 a.m., the matron had arrived, and Alma had washed and changed into a sober brown dress with a lace collar. It was at this moment, in the presence of Police Constable Bright, that Inspector Carter formally cautioned Alma and charged her with the attempted murder of her husband. Alma remained completely calm and unemotional. She dictated a statement to Carter, repeating the playing cards with her husband's story, adding that during it, he dared her to kill him, and that she had struck him with the mallet because he taunted her that she did not have the guts to do it. After Carter wrote the confession down, Alma read it aloud with a steady voice and signed the document while sitting on her bed. Preparing to be taken away, the ever-practical Alma retrieved her checkbook from a drawer, anticipating that she would need to manage her children's and household's finances, and donned a brown hat and a fur coat. As she walked to the bottom of the stairs, she encountered her lover, George Stoner, and Irene Riggs. She cryptically warned them not to make fools of yourselves. Stoner, acting in his capacity as the family's chauffeur, drove the police car containing Alma and Inspector Carter the short distance to the police station. Upon arriving at the forbidding Victorian building on Madeira Road, Carter formally charged her with attempted murder once again. Unflinching, Alma replied in a clear voice, "Yes, that's right, I did it deliberately and would do it again." The investigation into the attack at the Villa Madeira shifted dramatically on Thursday, March 28th, when a cascade of new evidence emerged. The first crucial development was the tragic news that Francis Rattenbury had finally succumbed to his head injuries at 8:15 a.m. With the victim dead, the charge against Alma escalated from attempted murder to murder, raising the stakes of the investigation to life and death. The facade Alma had constructed began to crumble that afternoon due to the intervention of Dr. William O'Donnell. Visiting the house, the doctor confronted Irene Riggs, asking if Alma had truly attacked her husband. When an adamant Irene insisted that she knew Alma had not done it, O'Donnell convinced the young woman that she had to tell the authorities everything she knew to save her employer's life. At 2:35 p.m., Irene provided a formal statement to the police detailing a shocking confession George Stoner had made to her the previous night while heavily intoxicated, admitting that he had killed Mr. Rattenbury and expressing his intent to travel to London to give himself up. Prompted by this explosive statement, the police immediately tracked down Stoner's grandparents and uncle in Ansbury Park. Their interviews provided the undeniable physical evidence the authorities needed. The family confirmed that Stoner had visited them on the night of the attack to borrow a wooden mallet, and his uncle positively identified the bloody murder weapon recovered at the scene as the exact tool he had lent to his nephew. A subsequent search of Stoner's bedroom cemented the case against him, uncovering a hotel bill from his recent stay in London with Alma, alongside a receipt for a diamond engagement ring. This firmly established their intimate relationship and provided a clear motive for the brutal crime. Armed with this undeniable proof of Alma's innocence in the physical attack, Bournemouth police urgently contacted Scotland Yard to arrest Stoner, who had traveled to Holloway Prison in London that morning, attempting to visit Alma. However, Stoner had been turned away at the prison gates and was already on a train heading back to the coast. Knowing their prime suspect was en route, Inspector Carter waited on the platform at the Bournemouth railway station, intercepting the 18-year-old the moment he stepped off the train at 6:35 p.m. to formally charge him with murder. On the night of the attack, between 10:15 and 10:30 p.m., George Stoner entered Alma's bedroom and got into bed with her. He appeared agitated, and after a few minutes of nervous evasion, confessed that he had hit her husband, Francis, over the head with a mallet. Initially stunned and silent, Alma struggled to fully comprehend his words until she suddenly heard a groan coming from downstairs, the unmistakable sound of a man in severe pain. Prompted by this distressing noise and Stoner's shocking confession, she immediately leaped out of bed and raced down the stairs. Upon rushing into the drawing room, Alma was met with a horrific scene. Francis was slumped heavily in his armchair, covered in a massive amount of blood. Drawing on her harrowing experience treating horrific casualties as a frontline nurse in France during the First World War, she quickly gauged the catastrophic severity of his head wounds, realizing that an elderly man was highly unlikely to survive such an attack. Desperate to assess his condition, she grabbed his hands and rubbed them, but found they were already completely cold. She frantically tried to locate his pulse, but felt nothing. She shook his limp body and pleaded with him to answer her, but he remained silent and unresponsive. As she stepped back from his chair in shock, her bare foot accidentally trod on something sharp hidden within the pool of blood on the carpet. Looking down, she realized she had stepped on his false teeth, which had been knocked completely out of his mouth by the sheer force of Stoner's blows. This gruesome discovery shattered her remaining composure. Plunged into a panic, she desperately tried to force the bloody dentures back into her husband's mouth, irrationally hoping that if his teeth were in place, he might be able to speak to her. Frantic and terrified, she raced back up the stairs to order Stoner to stay hidden in his room. Upon returning to the grisly scene in the drawing room, overwhelmed by a sickening wave of nausea, Alma poured herself a glass of neat whiskey and let out a piercing scream for Irene. Irene rushed downstairs to find the terrifying scene and immediately called Dr. William O'Donnell from the telephone located in Francis's ground floor bedroom. Dr. O'Donnell received the urgent summons at his home surgery at 11:30 p.m. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he immediately called for a taxi and was driven the short distance to the Villa Madeira, arriving around 11:45 p.m. He hurried through the front door, which had been left open for his arrival, and made his way down the dark hallway to the bedroom where Francis had been moved. Upon assessing the severe head wounds, swollen eye, and Francis's labored breathing, Dr. O'Donnell realized the situation was critical and required immediate hospitalization. Using the bedroom telephone, he urgently summoned a local surgeon, Alfred Rook. While waiting for Rook to arrive, O'Donnell enlisted the help of his waiting taxi driver to remove Francis's coat and vest. Once Rook arrived and confirmed the grave nature of the injuries, O'Donnell called ahead to the Strathallan nursing home to prepare for their arrival and subsequently accompanied the injured man in the ambulance. Later that night, O'Donnell also provided medical help to a frantic, intoxicated Alma back at the house, injecting her with a heavy dose of morphia to sedate her and force her to sleep. The authorities were alerted only after Francis had been transported to the nursing home. In the operating theater, as the surgeon cleaned the wounds and realized they were caused by a heavy blunt instrument, Rook instructed Dr. O'Donnell to call the police station. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. On May 27, 1935, the trial of Alma Rattenbury and George Percy Stoner opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, before Justice Travers Humphreys. The case had generated a nationwide media frenzy, drawing all-night queues of spectators. The courtroom was packed, particularly the public gallery, which was filled with fashionably dressed women eager to witness the climax of what the press had dubbed the Bournemouth Villa murder. Alma and Stoner stood together in the dock of Court Number 1, separated by a warder and a wardress. When the charges were read, both pleaded not guilty. The prosecution, led by Reginald Croom Johnson KC, opened by arguing that the pair had conspired to eliminate Francis Rattenbury because he stood in the way of their illicit affair. To establish Alma's overwhelming influence over the young chauffeur, Croom Johnson highlighted their recent trip to London, presenting it as an indulgent, luxurious escapade. Salesmen from Harrods were called to testify, displaying the expensive silk pajamas, suits, and a diamond ring Alma had purchased for Stoner to establish a clear motive and demonstrate her financial domination over him. The most anticipated witness was the household companion help, Irene Riggs. While she remained deeply loyal to Alma and tried to paint her in a sympathetic light, her testimony delivered a bombshell during cross-examination. Irene revealed that on the afternoon of the murder, a furious Stoner had claimed to have seen Rattenbury having sex with Alma. This explosive detail immediately provided Stoner with a motive of intense, blinding jealousy. Irene also testified that on the morning of Alma's arrest, Alma had quietly asked her to get the mallet from Stoner, strongly implying that Stoner was the one who had hidden the murder weapon. The court also heard conflicting accounts of Alma's state of mind when she falsely confessed to the murder. Dr. O'Donnell and Irene testified that Alma was heavily intoxicated and sedated with a massive dose of morphia, rendering her frantic statements utterly unreliable. However, police witnesses, including Inspector Carter, firmly insisted she was not incapably drunk and had confessed lucidly, arguing she should be held accountable for her words. Stoner's defense counsel, Joshua Caswell, attempted to build a defense around the claim that Stoner was a cocaine addict whose mind was so distorted by the drug that he hallucinated the sexual encounter between Alma and her husband, driving him to temporary insanity. This defense quickly unraveled. Dr. Grierson, a prison medical officer, testified that Stoner had described his supposed cocaine as a brown powder with black specks, proving the inexperienced youth had likely never even seen the drug. Fearing that Stoner would stubbornly confess to the murder in open court just to protect Alma, Caswell made the difficult decision not to put his client in the witness box. In a massive legal gamble, Alma took the witness stand on the third day of the trial. She proved to be a highly effective and unflinchingly candid witness, freely admitting to her adulterous infatuation with Stoner. She shocked the courtroom by confirming that they had slept together in the master bedroom, while her 6-year-old son was sound asleep on the other side of the room. Regarding the night of the murder, she maintained a strict barrier of memory loss, claiming that the sheer shock of discovering her husband's mutilated body, combined with the alcohol she drank to numb the horror, had erased her memory of her confessions to the police. However, she firmly and emotionally insisted that her first and only thought upon hearing Stoner's confession in her bed was a desperate desire to protect him. The closing arguments relied heavily on polarizing the two defendants based on rigid class and gender stereotypes. Caswell painted Stoner as an innocent, respectable, and naive English boy who had been completely corrupted and manipulated by an insatiable older woman. Shockingly, Alma's own defense counsel, Terence O'Connor, allied himself with this moral outrage in order to save her life. He urged the jury to separate their disgust for her moral turpitude from the actual crime of murder. He argued that Alma was merely a foolish, degraded woman who had accidentally created a jealous Frankenstein in Stoner, a monster she could no longer control. In his summing up, Justice Humphreys officially dismissed the cocaine defense. He delivered a scathing attack on Alma's character, labeling her an adulteress lost to all decency and expressing revulsion at her lifestyle. However, he strictly warned the jury that they must not convict her of murder simply because they despised her morals. He echoed the defense's sentiment that Stoner was a pitiable victim of Alma's seduction and domination. On May 31st, after deliberating for just 48 minutes, the jury returned to a tense and silent courtroom. Alma was found not guilty of all charges. Stoner, however, was found guilty of murder, though the jury added a strong recommendation for mercy. While Stoner stood completely stoic and silent to receive his mandatory sentence of death by hanging, Alma let out a devastated cry of, "Oh, no," and collapsed. She was carried out of the court by wardresses, shattered by the realization that her truthful testimony had cleared her own name but condemned her young lover to the gallows. Following her acquittal, Alma Rattenbury was in a state of utter collapse and required medical attention in the basement of the Old Bailey before she could leave. Supported by 2 police matrons and accompanied by Dr. O'Donnell, she was smuggled out of a side entrance to avoid the booing, hostile crowds. Her sister-in-law, Daphne Pinky Kingham, took her by taxi to the Belgravia home of Keith Miller Jones, Francis Rattenbury's nephew. A mob of reporters followed them, prompting Miller Jones to call the police to clear the street and to summon Dr. Bathurst from Harley Street to examine Alma. Finding her in a state of shock, Dr. Bathurst arranged for her to be admitted to the Cleveland nursing home in Bayswater. Upon her arrival at the nursing home, the matron noted that Alma was in a highly delicate mental state, though she remained charming to the staff. She showed no signs of drug dependency and did not consume or crave alcohol. Visited that evening by her loyal companion help, Irene Riggs, Alma obsessively relived the trial and gave explicit instructions for her own funeral, insisting that she be dressed in pink and surrounded by pink flowers, as she had a horror of white. She frantically wrote to her solicitor, Lewis Manning, urging that absolutely no money be spared in the fight for Stoner's reprieve. Fixated entirely on her condemned lover, she told the matron she intended to kill herself the moment Stoner was hanged. Denied permission to visit him at Pentonville prison, she spent a restless, sleepless night after writing him a desperate letter. Over the weekend, Alma remained trapped inside the nursing home, which was besieged by journalists and curious onlookers. She sent a nurse to buy armfuls of backdated newspapers and chain-smoked as she read the horrific things the press and the judge had said about her. She attempted to write a song, but the lyrics were morbidly focused on death. "We will die together, you and I. We will swing together." Her despair deepened when she mistakenly heard Stoner had been moved to Brixton, fearing he had not received her letter, though the matron managed to confirm he was still at Pentonville. On Sunday, her 43rd birthday, she talked wildly of suicide and begged to see Stoner. By Monday, June 3rd, Alma appeared to rally. The matron arranged for a hairdresser and manicurist to visit, and Alma received a permanent wave and a massage. When Dr. Bathurst visited that afternoon, Alma seemed cheerful, discussing her plans to publish her songs and investigating how many years Stoner might serve if his sentence were commuted to life imprisonment. However, this calm was deceptive. At 9 p.m., she received a female visitor, and by 10 p.m., Alma was fully dressed, packed, and determined to leave the facility. Defying the matron's pleas that she was too ill to leave, Alma declared, "I'm a free agent," and was driven away into the night. Desperate to escape the relentless public scrutiny, she consulted another doctor who advised her to hide her identity. She checked into the Elizabeth Fulcher home in Marylebone under the pseudonym Mrs. Martin, claiming she wanted to forget her ordeal and make a fresh start. On the morning of Tuesday, June 4th, Alma awoke, claiming to have had her best night's sleep since her husband's death. While drinking coffee in bed, she wrote a lengthy, impassioned suicide letter. She expressed intense guilt for not sticking to her original false confession, lamented the smashed lives of her children, and defended the purity of her love for Stoner, writing, "It is better I just fade from the picture. Kinder for them. The pain in my heart is so intense, it is almost not a pain." Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Telling the matron, Mrs. McClellan, that she wanted to go shopping, Alma borrowed £2 under the guise of buying toys for her children. Wearing her fur coat and a fawn hat, she traveled to the Oxford Circus tube station with the intention of throwing herself under a train. Finding the platform and the subsequent streets too crowded with shoppers to carry out the act, she realized she needed a secluded location. While in the West End, she used the borrowed money to purchase a pink crepe de chine nightdress to serve as her shroud, and an 8-inch knife in a sheath from a hardware shop. Alma returned to the nursing home for lunch and wrote a brief diary note absolving everyone else of responsibility for her actions before leaving again at 2:30 p.m. She traveled to Waterloo Station, where she tossed a coin to determine her final destination, just as Stoner often used to do. The coin dictated Christchurch, and she boarded the 4:30 p.m. express train. During the journey, she drank tea in the buffet car, looking white and drawn, and feverishly scribbled fragmented thoughts on the backs of envelopes. She pleaded not to be buried near her husband, and lamented that her truthful testimony had failed to save her lover. Arriving in Christchurch at 8 p.m., Alma walked across the sodden marshlands to Three Arches Bend, the exact spot where Stoner had once told her he nearly jumped from a moving train. Waiting for darkness to fall, she watched the swans on the Clockhouse stream and smoked a cigarette. She scribbled her final words on the back of a letter from her son Christopher. "It is beautiful here, and I am alone. Thank God for peace at last." At 8:30 p.m., a local cowman named William Mitchell spotted her sitting on the riverbank. As Mitchell watched, Alma removed her hat and fur coat, waded into the deep water, and drove the 8-inch knife into her own heart 6 times. By the time Mitchell and another laborer managed to pull her from the water with a wooden pole, she was already dead. On Saturday, June 8, 1935, Alma Rattenbury's funeral took place at Wimborne Road Cemetery in Bournemouth. Originally intended to be a simple, private affair, the event coincided with the Whitsun weekend, drawing thousands of holidaymakers to the coast. The burial swiftly descended into an undignified, morbid sideshow. A crowd of over 3,000 people swarmed the cemetery, trampling over graves and climbing on headstones to get a better view. Many spectators openly voiced uncharitable opinions about Alma and shouted abuse at her fiercely loyal companion help, Irene Riggs, suggesting they too had been involved in an improper relationship. The service was held in the cemetery chapel, its doors locked against the unruly mob outside. Inside, Alma lay in a polished oak coffin inscribed simply with her name and widow of Francis Rattenbury. Honoring her specific final requests, there were no white flowers. Instead, the coffin was surrounded by pink carnations, blue irises, and yellow roses. Among the floral tributes were wreaths bearing dramatic inscriptions, such as Atonement, Judge not lest ye too be judged, and To love is to suffer, from one who knows. A weeping Irene, wearing a long fur coat and a brown straw hat, attended the brief service alongside her parents, her sister, and Rattenbury's nephew, Keith Miller Jones. Following the chapel service, Reverend W.L. Freeman had to physically fight his way through the massive crowd to reach the burial plot, requiring special police detachments to clear a path. At the graveside, Irene was supported by her father, who happened to be a gravedigger at the cemetery, as Alma's coffin was lowered into the earth, lined with moss, pink pyrethrum, and mauve rhododendrons. Reverend Freeman read extra prayers for absolution and recited Psalm 130, deeply appalled by the crowd's utter lack of respect or sympathy. In a surreal twist, amidst the chaos of the burial, organizers were actively weaving through the spectators to collect signatures for George Stoner's reprieve. The campaign to save the 18-year-old Stoner from the gallows had gained immense momentum following his death sentence. His grandfather had convened a family conference, and his uncle Richard had even offered to sell property to fund an appeal. In Bournemouth, an accountant named F.W. Thistleton spearheaded a dedicated reprieve committee based in St. Peter's Road. They drafted a 9-point argument highlighting Stoner's youth, his alleged manipulation by an older woman, his supposed drug use, and the belief that executing him would serve no societal benefit. The campaign quickly secured the backing of influential figures, including Bournemouth's mayor, 2 local members of parliament, and the novelist Clemence Dane. The public response was phenomenal. Volunteers canvassed door to door, set up tables on beaches and in cinemas, and drove cars with petition forms plastered to their windshields. The committee was flooded with requests for forms from all over the country. In just 14 days, they collected a staggering 321,000 signatures. On Friday, June 14th, the massive petition was personally delivered to the Home Office in London carried into the building in 4 huge brown paper parcels. While the public rallied for his life, Stoner awaited his fate in the condemned cell at Pentonville Prison. On June 6, the prison governor informed him that his execution was set for June 18, and also broke the news of Alma's suicide. Stoner's stoic composure shattered. He broke down and sobbed into his hands. 2 days later, his lawyer's clerk visited him to officially lodge a notice of appeal. With Alma dead, Stoner surprisingly changed his stance. Over the Whitsun weekend, he handed his legal team a handwritten confession claiming complete innocence. In this new, highly improbable version of events, he stated he had fetched the mallet merely to pitch a tent, fell asleep, and awoke to find Alma in a terrified state in her bedroom, implying that she alone had battered Rattenbury to death. Armed with this new statement, Stoner's defense counsel, Joshua Caswell, raced to present the appeal, which was scheduled for Midsummer Day, June 24th. A fierce heat wave had settled over Britain, pushing temperatures to 28 degrees Celsius or 82 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Outside the Royal Courts of Justice, eccentric millionaires and anti-capital punishment campaigner Violet van der Elst arrived in a white Rolls-Royce, directing sandwich board men to parade the streets with signs demanding Stoner must be reprieved. Inside the stiflingly hot courtroom, Stoner stood between 2 warders, his face a completely gray mask of despair, as he faced a panel of 3 judges led by the formidable Lord Chief Justice, Lord Hewart. Caswell argued passionately that Stoner had only remained silent during the original trial out of a misguided romantic duty to protect Alma. Now that she was dead, Caswell pleaded for the court to allow Stoner to take the witness stand and tell this new truth. He also suggested that the trial judge, Travers Humphreys, had improperly steered the jury away from a manslaughter verdict. Lord Hewart was highly indignant, bristling at the criticism of his fellow judge and wholly rejecting the application for Stoner to testify. Hewart dismissed the proceedings as a mere waste of time over a sordid and squalid case, declaring that the corruption of a young lad by an abandoned older woman raised absolutely no new questions of law. In a brisk 15 minutes, the appeal was definitively dismissed, leaving a dazed Stoner to be led back to his cell to await the hangman. The final decision, however, rested solely with the newly appointed Home Secretary, Sir John Simon, who had the responsibility of advising the king on his prerogative of mercy. With the appeal having failed, Simon had to carefully weigh the trial papers, the judge and jury's recommendations, and the unprecedented public petition. The official approval came the very next day, on the evening of June 25, 1935. The Home Office announced that the Home Secretary had recommended a reprieve, commuting Stoner's capital sentence to penal servitude for life. The news brought overwhelming relief to Stoner and his family, and sparked jubilation among the campaign organizers in Bournemouth. Shortly thereafter, King George V issued the official royal pardon for Stoner at the end of June 1935. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Following his reprieve from the gallows, George Percy Stoner was transferred to Maidstone Prison. Recognizing his youth and good looks, authorities prudently placed him with younger offenders to protect him from predatory older inmates. There, he learned trades like carpentry and metalwork to mitigate the monotony of a life sentence and equip him for the outside world. His behavior was largely exemplary, leading the Secretary of State in August 1941 to authorize his release after serving just 7 years. He was transferred to Camp Hill Prison on the Isle of Wight for the final stretch of his sentence. His record was marred only once in March 1942, when he left his work group without permission to post a letter, earning him 3 days of close confinement, a bread and water diet, and a slight delay to his freedom. On May 27, 1942, Stoner was finally released into society on license for life. Stepping into a country fundamentally altered by the Second World War, Stoner initially found quiet work as a mechanic and tractor driver. In November 1943, he joined the Royal Army Service Corps, training as a lorry driver at Hadrian's Camp in Carlisle before being attached to the 755 Bulk Petrol Transport Company. While his unit was stationed in the Yorkshire mill town of Elland, he met a local girl named Christine Scully on a bus coming home from night school. After a year of courtship, Stoner bravely confessed his murderous past. Christine, having taken the measure of the man she loved, decided the scandal was a long time ago and best forgotten. With his unit mobilizing for the impending D-Day invasions, the couple married hastily in Elland on May 24, 1944. Following a quick cup of tea with family, they traveled to Bournemouth to visit his parents before Stoner embarked for France. He served his country commendably during the liberation of Europe, with his commanding officer praising him as an excellent soldier and capable driver, and he was awarded the 1939-45 War Medal upon demobilization in 1947. Returning to civilian life, Stoner moved back into his parents' bungalow on Red Hill Drive in Bournemouth. His mother had passed away near the end of the war, and when his father died in 1949, Stoner inherited the property and its modest estate. He and Christine welcomed a daughter, Yvonne, in 1948, though their hopes for a larger family were dashed by a tragic stillbirth a few years later. Despite the lingering, heavy notoriety of the Villa Madeira scandal, the Stoners stubbornly chose to remain in Bournemouth, attempting to live a quiet, ordinary life. It was a decision that left them highly vulnerable to relentless press harassment. Whenever the famous case was revived by playwrights, authors, or television producers, most notably with Terence Rattigan's play in the 1970s and an ITV film in the 1980s, the intensely private Stoner and his loyal wife were forced to endure fresh waves of unwanted tabloid scrutiny and doorstep ambushes. By the late 1980s, Stoner's health began to fail as he developed symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Christine noticed a distinct and frightening change in his personality. His brain no longer functioned as it once had, and the formerly gentle man grew increasingly aggressive. This mental decline culminated in a shocking and sordid incident in August 1990. A 12-year-old boy walked into a public toilet in Bournemouth and found the 73-year-old Stoner naked in a cubicle. Stoner beckoned the child, kissed him, and indecently assaulted him. Arrested the following day after police staked out the same location, Stoner was placed on 2 years probation, narrowly avoiding a return to prison due to his advanced age and deteriorating medical condition. The tragic episode briefly resurrected his name in the local headlines, dragging his dark past back into the light for a final time. Following his conviction, Stoner's decline steepened rapidly. He began attending a daycare unit, but as Christine struggled to cope with his condition, he was finally moved to a nursing home in 1996. He lived out his final days far removed from the passionate, dramatic youth that had once captivated the nation. George Percy Stoner died of a brain tumor and dementia at the age of 83. The date was March 24, 2000, exactly 65 years to the day after he took a wooden mallet and attacked Francis Rattenbury. In a haunting final coincidence, he passed away in Christchurch Hospital, overlooking the very water meadows and stream where Alma Rattenbury had plunged a knife into her own heart so many decades before.